All right, everybody. Hello. Today we are talking about ethics. We'll be talking about what ethics are, who decides which ethical principles we abide by, and when those principles have been ignored or avoided, or the cases that sort of sparked the need for ethical principles to be in place. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So, the first group that oversees ethical practice, specifically in psychological research, is the APA, the American Psychological Association. We've come to know them for their formatting as well, but they have their own set of ethical principles that they suggest that all researchers abide by. And more than suggest, these things are actually reviewed by the APA and by the other body that we'll talk about here in a minute to make sure that science is meeting up to these ethical practices. So we have beneficence and non-maleficence. All right, that's number one. We have fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect. And we will talk about each of these separately here. All right, so our first here, beneficence and non-maleficence, all right? This is very similar to, say, medical practice, where when we set out to conduct psychological research, we are hoping to do no harm. We do not want to harm anybody that we are engaging in professionally. So some cases this is physical harm, things like giving maybe pharmacological treatments, that might physically harm somebody. We want to prevent and do no harm to our participants. Psychologically as well. So we've talked in this class about the sort of bounds on our research projects and how we're unable to approach certain topics because of ethical considerations. For example, if we were to ask somebody about their suicidal ideation and they reported that they are currently thinking about suicide, it would be our ethical responsibility to refer them to a psychologist. And because we're working on a small scale in this class and we're asking other students, we want to avoid this altogether, right? Avoid doing any type of harm, be it physical, psychological. We have financially and socially as well. And financially might seem odd, right? How could a research study financially harm somebody? And we'll talk a little bit more about other components of psychological studies where money can be involved. But maybe a very poor family is traveling a very far distance to participate in a study that has a somewhat promising treatment for them in a disorder that they might have. Well, while this might not seem unethical on the surface, we don't want anyone being taken advantage of in any way, all right? And we do have a sort of workaround for this that we'll get to momentarily. All right, our next is fidelity and responsibility. So the idea here is that psychologists and researchers, all right, so we're sort of talking about two sides of the coin here. We're talking about therapists and counselors, but we're also talking about researchers that are working with people in a different way. But the idea is that psychologists, whether on the research or therapy side, are in relationships of trust with their clients, with their participants, or whoever they may be working with. So psychologists are to take responsibility for their actions and adhere to a professional standard of conduct, which is this here, as well as the other group that we'll be talking about who oversees ethical standards. All right, then we have integrity. We've probably heard this word before outside of this context, but being honest, okay? Academic integrity. We have an academic integrity clause here at our institution. The same goes for research on a higher level, right? Things like no plagiarism, reporting work honestly, not fabricating data, then reporting it as if you have found a very exciting finding. So being accurate, being honest, and being truthful. And unfortunately, science can be competitive at times, right? Sometimes you're competing for funding with other groups or other researchers. and it can sometimes incite this sort of lack of integrity, right, to get ahead. And luckily, we have safeguards in science, like repeating studies in order to ensure that findings that don't seem true or seem a little bit off base can be tested for their integrity. So this one's relatively straightforward. Honesty. All right, we need honesty in our science and in our psychological practice. We have justice, all right, the scales of justice. We've seen these in this class before. Remember, I like to say that psychology is a lot like the law, all right, that information is innocent until it's proven guilty. But this is a little different than that. We're talking about justice of persons, fairness, all right? And the idea is that we will have equality of access to all the benefits that psychology provides. And psychology provides a lot in terms of assisting what I like to call the human condition, right? We have therapy practices in place that we know are effective. We have research that can help to inform the masses. But I see a little bit of an issue here with this particular ethical principle, equality of access to the benefits of psychology, because we've discussed how this isn't entirely true, right? If we remember back to weird populations, all right, we know that weird, white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people have more access to research and psychology in general. So this is a principle that is applied. It is attempted to make its way into sort of mainstream psychology and the use of our psychological information. So it's something we want to consider, right? We don't want psychology to remain the psychology of psychology students. We don't want it to remain only for the wealthy and the educated. We want its benefits to reach all. All right, and our last one here is called respect for persons. And we'll be getting into greater depth with this when we start to create our own surveys in this course. But the biggest concern here is privacy, confidentiality, dignity, and self-determination. All right, so what does all of that mean? That means that you have a choice to participate in research. You should never be forced. And not only do you have a choice, but your information should be protected. And this is, of course, a big issue currently and in our technological age where information is everywhere you look. People are concerned with their private information, and this is a barrier, a hurdle for scientists to overcome, right? People are not always so open to sharing their personal information. But we follow some standards to ensure that people's rights are being protected in this way. We will collect data in a private and confidential manner. And we will also give our participants the autonomy to make decisions about themselves. So if you're answering a survey and a question makes you uncomfortable, you can stop, all right? That's part of the deal. All research is voluntary. But where this gets a little bit tricky is when we're working with potentially vulnerable populations, vulnerable groups. Right, we can brainstorm a couple, but think about groups of people who might be manipulated by researchers or not maybe understand what's being asked of them. All right, we can take children, we can take the elderly, we can take those with cognitive disability. So it's the role of the researcher and the responsibility of the researcher or the therapist to understand the limits or the vulnerabilities of the group that they are working with. So that's our respect for persons, and that's the last of our APA-regulated principles. So something else I want to bring up while we're at it here is that we have a similar model for animal research. We have a group, they're called IACUC here, International Animal Care and Use Committee. And they're similar to the APA or the next group that we'll talk about called the IRB, in that they have a set of ethical principles that those that use animals in their research must abide by. So this is a little bit complex because animal research is done in a number of ways. We can just observe animals, right? Watch them, don't interfere at all. But animal research gets as extreme as testing medication on animals or injecting substances into animals. And we can go on, right, while we're talking about ethics, we can talk about the ethics of this, right? There are two very extreme sides to this idea here. There are some people that think no animal should be captive under any circumstance, right? Not even domestic pets, right? That's one end of the spectrum. The other end is that we should stop at no cost for the pursuit of science, right? That if we can pursue scientific advancement using animal models, we would call them, that we should, right? And that sacrifice to those animals' quality of life is worthwhile. So we're not here to talk about what's right. You should certainly give it some thought and decide where you stand on using animals in research. But the idea is there is a group in place to protect them. All right, this group protects them. This group makes sure that living standards are up to a certain standard, that harm is not done. Remember, our do no harm, right, still exists here, but in a slightly different way, that the harm is minimized, and sort of so on here. So I have a couple, this image over here shows who's involved in these type of animal welfare committees. So it's an interesting topic. Animal research is happening all around us, all right? Lots of vaccines are tested in pigs, in rats. We have animal models that are very comparable to humans in multiple ways. We have species like rats and pigs that have similar organ structures to humans, so we can model the effects of medication and how it'll move through the body in those animals. And then we have more sort of cognitive models that we can use. Things like apes, chimps, primate research is often done to compare human behavior to their behavior. So interesting stuff. And we have a group in place to protect them. So now the next piece here is something called the IRB. The IRB is similar to the APA in that they have some oversight, all right? They look over research being done in the psychological field. The IRB was specifically established to protect the rights of human research subjects, so we're back to human subjects or participants. And what the IRB does is a cost-benefit analysis of any research being done. And so what a cost-benefit analysis does is determines if the benefit of the research will outweigh any of the cost. All right, and here when we're talking about cost, we're talking about negative effects unto those who are participating. So you might be thinking, right, why would we ever want to harm somebody when we're doing psychological research? But think about psychological phenomena that we want to research, things like fear, things like pain, right? Even if we want to study them, we don't want to inflict them on anybody, but they might be there as part of an experiment. And I always move back to drug studies, right? Take a drug with a very tough side effect, all right? And we always hear this in our pharmaceutical advertisements. But side effects, right? If a medication is promising in treating a chronic illness, we might be willing to take the risk for the benefit of potentially alleviating or curing whatever issue that person is facing. But there might be an associated cost, right? And again, I think you've probably heard on our advertisements all of these side effects, right? Shortness of breath, hair loss, liver damage, right? The list goes on and on. Those are the costs, right? The potential costs of participating. So when you do any research, you have to submit a proposal. You have to submit to the IRB. Any institution that has research going on its campus, published research, will go through the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. So you submit a proposal, you have to be transparent, all right? What's that word? That means that you have to be honest, all right? Back to our integrity. You have to be honest with what you are doing in your particular study. And then if you want to change your method, you have to submit again, all right? And the IRB proposal process can be a little bit tough. It can take a bit of a long time. They might come back to changes that you have to make before they will approve the study. So they oversee much of what is done in the field. And they have their own set of principles. Some are similar to the APA's principles. Some are different. So we have no harm, all right? That's the same as our beneficence and non-maleficence. No harm to the participants. We also have something called informed consent, all right? Informed consent. Informed consent explains the procedures and rights of the research to the participant. So you'll explain things along the lines of that this will be anonymous, right, and confidential, that you're able to stop at any time. And in fact, we'll be putting an informed consent on our surveys. So when we send them out to others, they understand their rights and are informed of their consent to participate in our studies. All right, so confidentiality, that's protection or privacy of research participants. We will not be collecting identifying information on any of our participants. And then we have deception. Right? Deception doesn't sound like a very ethical word, right? But deception is often used in psychological research. Deception is meant to sort of throw somebody off of what you are trying to measure. All right, and while this seems, again, unethical, and we can actually do this in ways that produce very little to no harm on an individual. Let me give you an example. A study I had heard about in my peripheral research zone was looking at sensation and perception, all right, another field of psychology that focuses on our senses, right? What information do we intake from our various senses and how does it affect our mind and our body? So this sensation and perception study was aiming to determine if the sound of running water increased urge to urinate in individuals, all right? I'm sure we've all heard of this phenomena before, but somebody wanted to put it to the test, right? So they didn't want to just sit someone in a room with running water and ask them if the running water made them need to urinate more, right? That would sort of give away what the study was all about. So what they came up with was a screening survey for, I think they called it diabetes, a diabetes screening survey, where one of the symptoms is an increased urge to urinate. So they had 2 rooms where they had people take the survey. In one room, a quiet room with no running water, one in a room with running water. There were over 20 questions on the survey, but they were only interested in one question, and they were interested in how badly do you need to urinate right now? All right, that was basically the question that they honed in on, of course with some others and some confounds. But that was some deception, right? They didn't think that they were being tested on what they were actually being tested on, but no harm was done to the participants. So deception can be useful. We don't fully inform the participant about the research, but we want to be sure that it's not doing any harm. And then we have something called debriefing. So after a study is completed, the researcher will debrief what was actually being done. This is sometimes immediately after a study is completed. Sometimes it's a ways into the future, right? It depends on how important the nature of the deception in your study is. All right, so a little bit more on informed consent here. All right, informed consent is a document that includes the purpose, procedures, and approximate duration of the research, basically so the participant knows what they are getting into. They're also aware that they can refuse to participate and they can withdraw their research. All right, and this is very important. If somebody participates in a survey and then contacts you and says, hey, I don't want to be a part of your study anymore, we have to destroy their records, all right? Not just take them out of the study. We can't keep their data for any longer. We have to completely destroy their records of participation, all right? So this is how we try and maintain trust with participants, because as you'll see here momentarily, I'll give examples of studies that have broken the trust, the public trust in researchers, right? And I'll give some examples in psychology, but it's sort of across the board. All right, then debriefing, another one that's a little bit different than what we had seen in the APA principles. So debriefing is a time for the researcher to talk to the participant and address any questions that the participant has, and then inform them of the result of the research if they care to know. All right, oftentimes individuals will participate in research to get a diagnostic test of a disorder that they're suspicious that they have, but they're not sure, right? They'll ultimately have the rights to that information once the research concludes to a point where that information can be shared. So that's debriefing. A lot of cases don't require debriefing, all right? Many studies will be straightforward enough where the information present will be duly explained throughout the course of the study. And in our case, most of us will be this way, right? We won't need to debrief students on the survey that they just took, but this is common practice for research. All right, now we're talking incentives, okay? Incentives. You can incentivize people to take part in your research. And this goes back to taking financial advantage of participants. This can go two ways, right? This could be paying a impoverished family to participate in research, sort of almost bribing them to participate in the research. Or the inverse can be true, that the research can be seen as so valuable that families or individuals will take steps that will financially disadvantage themselves in order to participate for the potential benefit of the study. So it's a little bit complicated, right? There are lots of different scenarios here, but incentives are part of the way that we soften that, all right? We can incentivize people to participate using money, right? Using gift cards, using credit in classes, right? You might have encountered that before. But the idea is it has to be fair across participants, and it cannot be used to manipulate or bribe or target people. So it's usually fair, made as fair as possible, and made the same across the board. And I always laugh. I have this list of kind of gift cards and incentives here and Bitcoins on here. That's how you can tell this is an outdated image. Because if you were rewarded with Bitcoin for a study, that would be pretty great, wouldn't it? So, all right, let's go ahead on to deception. All right, a little more about deception. So deception can't be done if it incurs risk. All right, can't be done if it incurs risk. Individuals must be debriefed if deception is used so that they understand what the research was. And then I asked, can deception be positive? And I think I've already answered that. Yes, it can be. It can be fine, right? It can be a great way to get at information without giving away your study or potentially manipulating responses from your participants. And then I ask here, what's an extremely common form of deception in research? And we've talked about this a little bit before, but a placebo pill, all right? And a placebo pill is a sugar pill or an inactive pill if we're doing a drug study. So how one of these studies would work is, let's take a psychological disorder. Let's take fibromyalgia, all right, a nerve pain disorder. So let's say that we want to test the efficacy of a new pill, a new drug that treats fibromyalgia. Well, we would get a sample, all right, of individuals with fibromyalgia. Let's say we get 60, all right. Then our basic experimental design, all right, kind of the heart of an experimental design is randomly assigning participants to a control group and an experimental group. They're randomly assigned in a blind manner. We use the term blind, and oftentimes even in a double-blind way, where the researchers themselves don't even know who received what pill, right? So the researchers are even being deceived in that case. But the idea is we don't want anybody thinking that they're not getting medicated, all right? So we're deceiving everybody in the study into believing they're getting medicated, right? So say we have a group of 60 people, we give 30 the placebo, 30 the active pill. Researchers will collect data on those individuals, then ultimately compare those groups. Usually somebody like a research assistant will be keeping track of who is actually in which group. So this is very common. And it sounds, right? It sounds bad because you have people who have these disorders who are looking for help, right? And they go to get help and they're being deceived into believing they're getting medication. But that's what debriefing is all about, and that's what incentives are all about, right? Oftentimes they'll give participants the opportunity to say, try the active version of the drug if they're interested in doing so. So deception is common. That's one of the most common ways deception is used. And it can be helpful, right? It can be helpful to make sure that we're getting valid data. All right, so now I'm going to walk us through a couple of unethical studies, all right? So the reason that all these ethical guidelines are in place is because they have been violated in ways in the past. And in the past, we've maybe not recognized how important it is to have these safeguards in place. All right, so here's a great example. This is commonly referred to as the monster study. a husband and wife, a set of researchers, set out to complete this study. This was done in 1939. It was done in Iowa. And their population of interest was children. And the sample they used were 22 orphans. All right, they got consent, all right, remember informed consent. They got consent from the orphanage, right, but not from these children's parents. In a normal situation these days, right, in the modern day, we have to get what we call assent from kids, a verbal agreement to participate in what's being done, and we need informed consent from the parents. All right, so neither of those things were obtained here. This was also a long time ago, but these children were not given rights, right? They were not given the rights that we try to hold our participants to. So what happened here is we took 22 orphans, and they split them into two groups. They gave one group affirmative speech therapy, all right, and they gave the other group negative speech therapy. So if the children had a pre-existing stutter or any other speech impediment, if they were in the positive group, they would be reassured of their abilities, positively reinforced to try and improve their speech. If they were in the other group, averse techniques were used. So if a child made a mistake with their speech, expressed their speech impediment, they would be belittled and ridiculed and punished. And they wanted to see which of these two options were more effective. And knowing what we know about behaviorism today, we know that positive reinforcement is almost always more effective than punishment. So what ended up happening here was the children in the averse therapy group grew up with speech impediments, and in fact they were worsened by the therapy. These children were checked in on later in their lives, and their speech impediments and issues persisted. So we would call this very costly, right? This cost these children their sort of autonomy in later life, right? In their ability to speak. And they were taken advantage of, right? They weren't given the formal consent that we would have given, say, today, or given under a more watchful eye. So that's one example of how our ethical principles can prevent harm like this from being done. All right, this one's a classic, right? You've maybe heard of this. There's a great documentary on this as well if you want to get more familiar. But the Stanford prison experiment, Zimbardo was the scientist behind this one, and Zimbardo's still alive. He talks at conferences, and he has much to say. It's very interesting that we still have a scientist from part of such a controversial study. So the Stanford prison experiment was a basic experimental design. They took a group of young men. They took college-aged men. This was done at Stanford. And they put the men into one of two groups. They screened men to make sure that they had no pre-existing psychological issues, things like aggression. They took these men, they put them into two groups, and they randomly assigned them to the role of a prisoner or a guard. And within a couple of days, all right, 2 days into the experiment, this was set to last for a while. But within 2 days of the experiment, violence broke out, right? Rioting and violence. The guards took so much precedence in their position that they were doing things like denying the prisoners from using their bodily functions in a normal way, confining them to their cells, using physical force. And the study was ultimately stopped completely. And the idea here is that there has been lasting harm on those who were involved in the study because we saw a very bad side of human nature here. And why it's so important, why it's so noteworthy, is we've seen this type of behavior in the world outside of research. All right, Abu Ghraib was a prison in which this sort of model took place where there was torture of prisoners. So we can't do this again today. All right, that's sort of the take home from this, is that we learned very much from this study, but the cost outweighed the benefit, right? Those involved had lasting negative outcomes as a result of this, and it's still talked about today. You likely talked about it in your intro psych class. And again, it's a very well-documented study, so if you're interested, I would say take up a documentary, watch a YouTube video on this. It's some interesting stuff. All right, then we have something called the Aversion Project. All right, this centers around one doctor. And this is interesting because it takes a look at ethics and the management of these things outside of our borders here in the US. So this was during apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was the legal segregation in South Africa that persisted late into the 20th century. South Africa has had a rich history in legal segregation. So what we have here is a doctor, Dr. Aubrey Levin. He was in the armed forces. He was born in South Africa. He ended up in Canada. But he was put in a position, he was a psychiatrist, and he was put in a position of curing homosexuals, specifically those involved in the armed forces in South Africa. And he did so using some very unethical means. The idea of this study is unethical in itself, but electroconvulsive therapy was used, aversion therapy. And if we're not familiar with this, right, you've maybe heard of conversion therapy, converting those who are in the LGBT group. But aversion therapy is even different than that. Aversion is trying to create an averse reaction to the stimuli that the person is attracted to. So things like having a gay man watch gay porn and then emitting electric shocks to the person. So it's basically torture. There were chemical castrations done at this time. But the issue here is none of this was against the law in South Africa. So this man actually went back to Canada and continued performing as a medical doctor, right? He was a psychiatrist and he was a professor at the University of Calgary, I believe, for many years until he was later taken in on a sexual assault case. So this one's a little tough, right? This isn't very fun to think about, very unethical. But it's really an illustration of how these things are handled even regionally, right? And this was recent. This was back in about the 80s that he still was able to come back to Canada and continue his practice. So this isn't that old, right? This is in our recent history. And we know that things like this are still going on in our more underdeveloped areas in the world, or countries that are facing sort of a more cultural issue where these things are overlooked. Okay, this one's a little more lighthearted, but still very powerful. This is called the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes experiment. This was done by a woman named Jane Elliott, and this one's particularly interesting because Jane Elliott was not a researcher. She was a school teacher, an elementary school teacher. She was working with around 8-year-old students, and she conducted this little experiment, all right, this study, the day after the Martin Luther King assassination. Her goal, this is much like the idea with the Stanford prison experiment, basically pitting people against each other, although she didn't realize quite what she was getting into here. She basically created a privilege system in her classroom, much like the segregation that was happening in the US at the time of MLK's assassination. She gave blue-eyed children privilege over brown-eyed children in many facets in the course of her class. And she basically switched the privilege across these two groups. And what happened was, as you would imagine, right, think the Stanford prison experiment, the groups were pit against each other, all right? It's very easy to create what we call in-group and out-group sort of ideation. You might have learned about this or will learn about this in a social psychology class. But it's relatively easy to construct in-group and out-group and to pit people against each other. And that's what happened here. And Jane Elliott is excellent. She's also still alive today and gives talks at colleges. She might have slowed down recently, but she's excellent. And again, I recommend you hearing her speak. She's very convicted in her beliefs about basically artificial segregation, right? Segregation based on physical cues. And the message she was trying to send here was that the segregation happening in the US at that time was based on a trait no different than eye color. And illustrating the intensity of the behavior that could change when put under artificial segregation. All right, this is the last one we're discussing, which is the Milgram study. Again, you maybe heard about this in your intro psych class or a social psych class. The social psych studies are the ones that get into the most trouble because you're pitting people against other people generally. But here, the Milgram study was a test for obedience to authority. Right, so we have sort of a figure over here, the student, the teacher, and the experimenter. So the experimenter was telling the teacher what to do. And the basic format here was that the teacher was to administer electric shocks to the learner or the student if they got incorrect answers on a test that was being given by the experimenter. The study used deception. It was meant to look like a memory and learning study. There was false random assignment, so the student wasn't a real person hooked up to electric shock. They were involved with the study. They were basically an actor. We would call them a confederate. So whenever someone got a question wrong, or wherever it was reported that a learner or a student got a question wrong, the teacher was to administer increasing electric shocks. And then the image on the bottom left here shows that the more you go up on these switches on this switchboard, the more danger is being applied through those shocks. So much so that in the recordings and the people that they had expressing the kind of other side, the students or the learners, they would say things like they were in pain and to please stop. And the experimenter would urge them to go on. And that's what was being tested. How long would somebody go on administering shocks to this person that was supposedly on the other side of this wall when being told to do so by an authority figure? So again, we can never do anything like this today. Those who completed the study were very disturbed by what was being asked of them and what they ended up doing in order to continue experimenting. There's sort of an eerie phrase that is associated with this study, which is that the study must go on, even when the fake participants were in so much pain. So this is an example of bad deception, right? This isn't good. This is undoubtedly going to leave some psychological harm on individuals. So this is what we're trying to avoid today. So while these studies can be a little bit hard to learn about now, they really help to inform us about why these principles are in place. So that summarizes our ethics overview for the class. Please be in touch if you have any questions.